In today's video, I'm about to show you the most terrifying Bigfoot sightings ever recorded, from a private investigator reviewing trail camera footage of Bigfoot moving through a forest, to a trail runner whose GoPro captures something 9 feet of Sasquatch in full sprint ahead of him. Thomas Bannister had spent 20 years pointing cameras at animals in the Pacific Northwest forests. He had filmed bear behavior in the Cascades, followed wolfpack dynamics across 3 winters in Idaho, and spent 3 consecutive winters embedded with a Roosevelt elk herd in the Olympic Peninsula. He understood large animal behavior the way someone understands anything they have spent 2 decades watching closely, not from textbooks, but from the accumulated weight of having seen what was normal so many times that the first moment something was not normal registered before he could have explained why. He knew what hunting looked like. He knew what instinct looked like. What he watched on his editing screen on November 8, 2016, was neither of those things. It was something he did not have a word for yet. And the word he eventually settled on, after a year of working through what the footage meant, was the reason he made a decision at the end of that year that most people in his field thought was wrong. He withheld evidence, deliberately. He had a second clip, captured almost a year after the first, and he chose not to release it, not because he doubted what it showed, but because of what a year of studying the first clip had taught him about what was living in that forest. And the reasoning behind that decision is the part of this story that does not resolve cleanly. Thomas had arrived at the Hoe River area of Olympic National Park in late October 2016, following Roosevelt elk through the early stages of their winter migration. The Hoe rainforest was old-growth Pacific Northwest at its most dense, Douglas fir and Sitka spruce with canopies so thick that midday light barely touched the ground. The river flats pulled elk down from the ridges, and the game trails were ancient, worn so deep into the soil by generations of the same animals using the same routes for so many years that the paths looked more like trenches than trails. Thomas had been in this area before. He knew the river crossings. He knew the game trails. He knew exactly which crossing to put a camera on to get footage worth driving all the way from Seattle for. He bolted a high-resolution motion-activated unit 12 feet up a Douglas fir on November 1st, angled toward a shallow crossing point where fresh elk tracks showed the animals had been coming through regularly. The camera could record in clear detail even in near darkness, and its trigger was fast enough to catch almost any animal that moved through the frame. Thomas checked the angle, made sure the battery was full, and drove back to his camp near the park entrance. He planned to come back in 5 days, pull the memory card, see what he had, and reposition the camera if he needed to. He pulled the card on November 8th. He was expecting elk footage. The clip from 6:44 a.m. on November 3rd opened on a normal dawn scene. Soft gray light coming through the trees, the river moving slow and dark, a section of muddy bank where the water got shallow enough to cross without much trouble. The motion trigger had caught a young black-tailed deer stepping into the shot from the left side of the frame, picking its way carefully down the bank toward the water with the nervous start and stop walk of an animal that was paying attention to its surroundings but had not picked up on anything specific to be scared of yet. The deer looked like it weighed around 90 pounds, young, still a little unsure of itself, ears swiveling to catch any sound, nose testing the cool morning air. It reached the edge of the water and put its head down to drink. The camera was still running when the big cedar tree on the right side of the frame suddenly had something behind it that had not been there a moment before. Bigfoot stepped out from behind the trunk of a massive old-growth cedar about 40 feet from the deer and placed itself with a kind of slow, deliberate purpose that was completely unlike anything Thomas had seen in 20 years of wildlife filming. It did not wander in. It did not step through. It placed itself. One moment the cedar was just a cedar. The next moment something was using it as a hide, and the way it tucked in behind the trunk, the exact angle it picked to stay out of the deer's sightline, the instant total stillness it dropped into the moment it was in position. All of it communicated one thing without any ambiguity at all. This was a plan, already in progress before the camera caught it. Bigfoot was at least 8 feet tall. Its hair was dark brown with lighter coloring across the face and chest, and the individual hairs were clearly visible in the morning light, moving slightly in the river breeze the way real hair moves, the way actual individual strands shift at different speeds when the wind catches them, darker along the spine and thicker on the arms where the coat was more matted. Its shoulders were wider than anything Thomas had ever pointed a camera at. Its arms, visible where they gripped the bark of the cedar, hung past its knees. Its hands, spread out flat against the tree trunk, covered what Thomas would later estimate at nearly 3 feet of bark, and then nothing moved, not once. The deer kept drinking, head down, completely unaware. Bigfoot had not made a sound. The position it had chosen put it in the cedar shadow and broke up its outline enough that from the deer's direction it was almost invisible. And that was not an accident. To choose that specific position required knowing in advance where the deer would be looking. The deer had been completely outthought. 17 seconds passed. The camera recorded every one of them. During those 17 seconds, Bigfoot didn't move a single time. No weight shifts, no muscle twitches, none of the small involuntary movements that every large animal makes simply from being alive. Its head stayed locked on the deer, tracking without a single adjustment. Whatever was happening in Bigfoot's mind, the body was under a level of voluntary control that had no equivalent in any predator Thomas had ever studied. He would later say the stillness was the most disturbing part of the whole clip, not what came after it, but what it implied about what was going on before. Then it launched. That was the word Thomas used every single time he described what came next. Not ran, not charged, launched. From total stillness to full speed in what looked like a single movement. No building, no transition, no middle stage. One moment completely still behind the cedar. The next moment covering ground at a speed the camera's microphone recorded as heavy thumping impacts, each one barely a fraction of a second apart. Each one hitting like something very large and very fast was making contact with the earth. 40 feet in under 3 seconds. The deer's head came up at the second footfall. Its legs loaded, its hindquarters dropped, its whole body gathered to run. The exact sequence of a prey animal that has just understood it needs to leave right now. The reaction was fast. Any predator that Forrest had, mountain lion, bear, wolf, would have watched the deer clear the gap. Bigfoot was already there before the deer's legs could fire. What happened at the moment of contact was the part of the footage that made every person who watched it go quiet. Bigfoot did not drive the deer to the ground, did not crash into it, did not do what any predator in that ecosystem would do, use body mass and impact to bring it down. Instead, in one motion, flowing directly out of the sprint, Bigfoot reached down with one arm and simply picked the deer up. One arm, one motion. A 90-pound animal in full panic, legs pumping against nothing, throwing its body weight in every direction, and Bigfoot absorbed all of it without breaking stride. The deer ended up tucked under Bigfoot's arm like a carried object, controlled and going nowhere, while Bigfoot crossed the remaining stretch of riverbank and hit the tree line at the same speed it had been running since the cedar. By the time it reached the trees, nothing about the way it moved suggested it was carrying anything at all, just the deer's legs sticking out, still kicking, and the sounds the deer was making, still audible on the camera's microphone, until the forest took both of them. 31 seconds from Bigfoot's first appearance to the moment the trees closed behind it. The camera kept recording for 2 more minutes after that, showing nothing but the empty riverbank and the slow-moving water. The section of the bank where the deer had been drinking looked completely undisturbed. No blood, no tracks scattered in panic patterns, no fur or debris of the kind any other predator encounter leaves behind. The scene looked almost exactly the same as it had before any of it occurred, which was its own kind of disturbing because it meant this was practiced. A cleanup this complete, an exit this clean and fast, did not happen by accident the first time. And if it was not the first time, then this river crossing had a history that nobody had been present to document. The deer that had come to this water source over months and years before Thomas's camera arrived had come and gone from a crossing that was being hunted regularly, and no evidence of any of it had been left behind for anyone to find. Thomas watched the clip 7 times before he drove back to Seattle. He spent the first full day running every check he knew from 2 decades of documentary work. The hair moved differently on different parts of Bigfoot's body. the strands across its shoulders responding to the breeze differently than the thicker matted sections lower down its arms, exactly the way real hair of different lengths behaves in wind. Beneath the hair, the muscles of its shoulders and upper back were visibly working as it ran, in the same shifting, rolling pattern that any large running animal produces. During the stillness behind the cedar, Bigfoot's chest rose and fell with its breathing. He spent a long time on the hands. The grip on the cedar trunk was 5-fingered, each finger fully wrapped around the bark, with a span that no human hand came close to matching. The single-arm scoop that lifted a panicked 90-pound animal mid-sprint, one smooth downward motion, complete control, no visible exertion, no change in pace. Thomas had spent 20 years filming large animals. He understood enough about what bodies could and could not do to know that what he had just watched placed Bigfoot in a category of physical strength that nothing he had ever filmed belonged to. He ran the speed numbers multiple ways. The distance from the cedar to the deer was 40 feet, a measurement he had made himself on his last visit to the location. Bigfoot had covered that distance in under 3 seconds, starting from a complete standstill, maintaining that speed through the grab, and through carrying a struggling animal all the way to the forest edge. The numbers he kept arriving at were somewhere between 25 and 28 miles per hour. Bigfoot's estimated weight, based on body proportions, put it in the same class as a large male grizzly bear. A grizzly's top sprint is faster, but only over short distances and with nothing to carry. The combination of that speed, that weight, and that grip strength while managing a 90-pound struggling animal had no match in any wildlife data Thomas could find. But the speed, by the time he had finished analyzing the 17 seconds, was almost beside the point. He reached out to a wildlife biologist he had worked with before, someone who ran an independent research station near Ashford and had a reputation for careful, skeptical work. The biologist watched the footage, asked for a second copy, and called Thomas back the same evening. The call went on for 2 hours. What the biologist kept returning to was not the speed or the strength, it was the 17 seconds. Those 17 seconds had no match anywhere in the documented behavior of large North American predators. Not bears, not mountain lions, the most patient ambush hunters in the region. Nothing in their behavioral records showed what the footage showed. Deliberate selection of a specific piece of cover based on the prey's approach direction, holding that position through 2 alert responses without a single movement, and timing the launch to the exact moment of maximum exposure. That was not predatory instinct, that was a hunting strategy. The biologist said those words carefully. Not a behavior, not a reflex, not an instinct, a strategy. Then the biologist brought up the cedar tree itself, and this was the point in the analysis where the question shifted from what Bigfoot could do to what Bigfoot knew. That game trail was old. The path had been worn into the soil by deer and elk, using the same route to the same water source for so many generations that it looked carved. Any large animal spending regular time in that forest would have crossed that trail many times and would have seen deer and elk using it repeatedly. The cedar Bigfoot used for cover was the single best concealment position at that approach angle, the only piece of cover that worked from the direction the deer had come from. To have chosen it, Bigfoot had to have known in advance which direction the deer would come from. That was not something figured out in the moment. That was accumulated knowledge of a specific hunting ground, built through repeated experience in that specific territory, which meant this was not Bigfoot's first hunt at this crossing, which meant Bigfoot had been hunting this river crossing from that cedar using that game trail long before Thomas's camera arrived, long before Thomas had ever been in this forest. And the deer that had come to this water source over those months and years had no idea what was waiting for them because Bigfoot had never given them a reason to find out. The biologist flagged one more thing in a follow-up call 3 days later. The deer had actually paused twice on its approach, once at the tree line, again at about 15 feet from the bank, rotating its ears and lifting its nose, doing the careful scanning of an animal that has registered something vaguely wrong without being able to identify a specific threat. The deer had, on some level, sensed something was there, and Bigfoot had held perfectly frozen through both of those moments. Not a twitch, not a readjustment. Nothing that let the deer's alarm system lock on and confirm. The biologist said he had spent years studying predator-prey dynamics in Pacific Northwest forests and had never documented any large predator with the impulse control to hold position through 2 close-range alert responses. That level of control, he said, was not something animals had. It was something that thinking things had. Thomas reached out to a second expert, a video forensics specialist who ran a small independent lab outside of Olympia and had done authenticity work on documentary footage before. He sent the full video file with all of the camera's built-in data left intact, the compression information, the timestamps from the internal clock, the GPS location data written directly into the file. He asked for a complete analysis and deliberately did not tell the technician anything about what the footage showed. The technician came back 8 days later with a full report. It went through every technical indicator of digital manipulation that video forensics tools could detect. How compression artifacts behaved across the file, whether the timestamps matched up correctly, how motion blur worked at the edges of the moving subject, whether the lighting stayed consistent as Bigfoot moved from shadow into the early morning light near the river, whether shadow directions matched the actual sun position for that timestamp, and GPS location. The report found 0 indicators of manipulation. Everything was consistent with genuine footage captured by that camera model under those lighting conditions on that morning. The technician added a personal note at the end. If someone had faked the footage, they would have needed to do it at a level of technical skill beyond anything achievable with standard equipment, and would have needed to know the exact position of a hidden elk camera, the exact time a deer would approach that crossing, and the exact quality of the light that specific morning. The simpler explanation, the technician wrote, was that the footage was real. Thomas presented the clip at a closed cryptozoology conference in British Columbia in December 2016. He put together a presentation that included the raw clip, his own frame-by-frame breakdown, and both independent expert reports. He had decided going in that he was not going to try to push the audience toward any particular conclusion. No dramatic voiceover, no leading questions, no attempt to get ahead of what people were thinking while they watched. He showed the clip, shared the data, and let the 31 seconds do the work. The response was the kind of divided, tense silence that precedes serious argument, because everyone in that room understood what the hunting sequence meant. Not a large primate opportunistically finding food. An apex predator with a defined method, deep territorial knowledge, and physical capabilities that placed it above every other predator in the Olympic Peninsula. The researchers who had spent years building behavioral evidence for Bigfoot's existence understood right away what they were looking at. The skeptics focused on what was missing: no carcass, no hair, no castable prints. Footage alone had never been considered enough. But underneath both reactions was the question that the hunting sequence actually raised, the one that did not resolve into either category. Not whether the footage was real, not whether more evidence was needed. How long had something with that level of hunting intelligence been operating in that forest, using those specific crossings, making decisions based on that specific territorial knowledge? And how many other forests were there, with their own crossings and their own cedar trees, where the same thing had been happening without a single trail camera ever being in the right place at the right time? Thomas announced at the conference that he was going back to the Olympic Peninsula in the spring of 2017 with a small team and proper search equipment, with the goal of finding physical evidence at and around the site. He was not done with the Hoe River corridor. Whatever had been using that cedar as a regular hunting position had been doing it before his camera arrived, and he believed it was still doing it. The spring 2017 trip brought him back to the river crossing with a 3-person team and equipment that included sensors for detecting buried organic material and dogs trained to locate wildlife remains. They searched the area around the cedar for 4 full days, expanding outward in the direction Bigfoot had gone when it left the frame. They found disturbed vegetation in a pattern consistent with the exit path. They found 1 partial impression in soft ground near the river's edge, too weathered to cast, but large enough and correctly oriented to be consistent with a very large bipedal footprint. That was it. The forest had done what Pacific Northwest old growth does: 4 months of rain and heavy biological activity had broken down and absorbed whatever evidence had been there. Nothing was left to recover. Thomas came back to Seattle with the spring findings and added them to the file he had been building since November. The partial imprint photographs, the mapped vegetation disturbance, the forensic lab report, the biologist's behavioral analysis, the speed and strength breakdown from his frame-by-frame work on the original footage. He compiled it into a single document and sent copies to the small group of researchers he trusted to handle it seriously. In September 2017, he returned again. He set cameras at 12 locations within a 2-mile radius, not to catch Bigfoot directly, because he had already understood that the original clip had only happened because the camera was there for elk. Whatever awareness Bigfoot had about human activity in its territory put it at a permanent advantage over any camera placed deliberately to find it. He went back to understand the territory, what Bigfoot used, how it moved through the forest over time. The cameras ran through fall and into early winter 2017. Several captured elk footage exactly as planned. One caught a black bear working a section of riverbank about half a mile north of the original location. 3 recorded nothing except the forest changing light and weather across the recording window. One camera, set up on a ridge overlooking the river corridor about 3/4 of a mile southeast of the cedar tree, caught something on the evening of October 19th, 2017. Something large and upright, moving through the thick undergrowth at the top of the ridge with the steady, unhurried pace of an animal that was not startled and was not in any rush to get somewhere. It was in the frame for less than 4 seconds, and the low light had pushed the image quality down to the point where specific details were hard to make out. But the shape was the same. The silhouette, how wide the shoulders were, how long the arms were compared to the rest of the body height, the 2-legged stride, matched what Thomas had spent the better part of a year studying in careful detail from the November 2016 clip. Whatever had used that cedar tree as a hunting blind was still in that forest almost a year later, still moving through it, still unhurried, still invisible to every deliberately placed camera in a 2-mile grid, and only caught it all because one unit happened to be pointed at the right ridge at the right moment. Thomas added the clip to his file and made the hardest professional decision of his career. He chose not to release it, not because he doubted what it showed, because a year of working through the behavioral evidence in the original footage had brought him to a specific conclusion about what kind of intelligence was operating in the Hoe River corridor. And that conclusion made him genuinely uncomfortable with the idea of directing more human attention into the territory it was living in. The 31 seconds had started as a question about what Bigfoot was. By the end of 12 months, it had become a question about what happens when something that intelligent, that capable, that practiced in remaining invisible, what happens when the world finds out exactly where it is. The November 2016 footage showed something faster than every other animal in that forest, stronger than every other animal in that forest, patient enough to hold 17 seconds of perfect voluntary stillness while a prey animal closed the distance, strategic enough to have chosen its hide based on advanced knowledge of how that specific animal would approach that specific water source. It had taken a 90-pound deer in a single-arm grab at full sprint, disappeared into old-growth timber in 31 seconds, and left a scene so undisturbed that the river crossing looked exactly as it had before any of it occurred. That footage, 31 seconds on a November morning by the Hoe River, remained the most complete behavioral documentation of Bigfoot ever captured. Not because of what it showed about Bigfoot's size or appearance, because of what those 17 seconds of total stillness before the sprint revealed about what was happening behind its eyes. The speed was extraordinary, the strength was extraordinary, but the plan, the selection of that cedar at that angle, based on that knowledge of that trail, was what put this footage in a different category from every piece of Bigfoot evidence that had come before it. What Thomas Bannister's trail camera caught on November 3, 2016, was not a Bigfoot sighting. It was a predator operating inside a territory it understood completely, faster than everything else in that forest, stronger than everything else in that forest, invisible to every deliberately placed camera in a 2-mile search grid for the entire following year, and apparently aware enough of human activity in its range to have adjusted its behavior accordingly. The 31 seconds of footage had started as a question about what Bigfoot was. The year that followed turned it into a question Thomas eventually decided he was not willing to answer out loud. What would happen to that territory and to what was living in it if the rest of the world came to understand exactly what it was capable of? He had a second clip. He kept it to himself, and the Hoe River corridor kept going, old growth and rain and game trails worn deep into the earth. And somewhere in it, if the October 2017 footage meant what Thomas believed it meant, the cedar tree by the river crossing was still there and still being used, and the deer still had no idea. Stellan Vare had worked on investigative cases for 11 years. A timber called him 4 days after their bulldozer went missing from a contested logging site in the Six Rivers National Forest in Northern California. Not stolen, not broken down, but missing in the sense that pieces of it had been found in 3 separate locations and nobody could explain how they had gotten there or what had been strong enough to separate them from the rest of the machine. The first step was collecting the camera grid the logging crew had already installed. Before he even walked the terrain or studied topographic maps, Stellan drove the access roads and flagged each motion-activated trail camera the loggers had mounted around the worksite and along the road where the machine had last been confirmed operational. The company had placed them weeks earlier to document equipment activity and keep records during the dispute, which meant the cameras had been watching the area long before the bulldozer disappeared. Over the years, those cameras had captured bears wandering through cut blocks, vandals slipping past locked gates, poachers checking game trails, and the occasional lost hiker cutting through timber roads after dark. In 11 years of reviewing footage like that, they had never recorded anything that made Stellan sit in his truck and replay the same clip multiple times before he could bring himself to step outside. Camera 4 was positioned along the edge of a dense section of old-growth Douglas fir, mounted at chest height on a tree just off the service road that ran along the upper logging boundary. The footage was 1 minute and 39 seconds long. Stellan had watched it on the small screen of his laptop, parked at the edge of that same service road with the engine off and the afternoon light coming in flat through the windshield. How could less than 2 minutes of footage contain the answer to a mystery that had already scattered a bulldozer across the forest? The first seconds showed the road at the point where it curved past the tree line before opening into the staging area. The light was poor. A heavy overstory kept the ground mostly in shadow, with a few narrow shafts coming through at angles, shifting slightly as the branches moved in a high wind that couldn't quite reach the ground. For the first 2 seconds, there was nothing. Then something moved in the shadows between the trees, and Stellan felt his body go still in a way it did not usually go still. What kind of thing moves through a dark forest at that size and that speed and doesn't bother to stay in the shadows? A Sasquatch stepped into one of the narrow shafts of light, and the light was enough. It was upright. It was massive. Reddish-brown hair covered it from head to foot, dense and layered, the coat thickest across the shoulders and upper back, where it bunched and shifted with each stride. It moved with the kind of weight that you don't fake, not the performed heaviness of someone trying to walk large, but the deep structural weight of something that has never once in its life needed to consider what might be bigger than it. Every step compressed the road surface with a finality that had nothing theatrical in it. Stellan's first thought, embarrassingly, was that the camera had malfunctioned. Some trick of the lens, a compression artifact, something that would resolve into a bear or a downed tree if he just let it settle. His second thought arrived about a half-second later, when the full figure came into the light and the scale of it became undeniable, and that second thought had no words attached to it. His hands had gone still on the laptop keyboard. He was not aware of deciding to stop moving. He just had. If the footage wasn't a malfunction, then what exactly was Stellan watching walk across the same road he was parked beside? 8 feet tall at minimum. He had done enough outdoor work, enough time measuring elk trails and bear markings against known reference points, to have a decent eye for height and scale, and he had never been far off. This was 8 feet, possibly a shade more, and he arrived at that number without having to think hard about it. The dead fur it passed at 11 seconds gave him his reference. The top of its head cleared a branch he could later measure at 7 feet 9 inches from the ground. The shoulders were the part that most resisted any effort to file it under something normal. A human being, even a very large one, has shoulders that fit inside a certain range, a range defined by the width of the skeleton beneath them, by the limits of what muscle can do to that frame. These did not fit inside that range. They were impossibly wide, rolling forward slightly with each stride in a way that suggested the whole upper body was built around a different set of proportions entirely. And the arms that hung from them were long in a way that had nothing to do with any human proportion Stellan had a reference for. They swung past the knees in a slow, heavy rhythm, each pendulum arc covering more distance than it should, the kind of rhythm that belongs to something that covers a lot of ground with very little effort, something that has never needed to hurry because hurrying has never been the point. If this forest was its territory, how long had it been watching the machines come through and tear it up? And how long had it been deciding what to do about them? Stellan watched it and noticed where it was going, the staging area. The Bulldozer sat at the far edge of the service road where the crew had left it the previous evening, blade down, engine cold, sitting on the same packed gravel it had been sitting on when the operator signed off. The Sasquatch was walking directly toward it, with the same purposeful, unhurried gait it had held since the moment it entered the frame. There was no detour, no hesitation, no slowing to assess the open ground or the unfamiliar terrain of the cleared road. It was walking toward that machine the way a person walks toward something they have already made a decision about. The decision had been made somewhere else before the camera ever picked it up, and what was happening now was simply the execution. The gait was unhurried. That detail landed harder than the size. A Sasquatch that large, moving in the open, along a service road, and there was no urgency in it at all. No scan of the terrain, no checking of angles, none of the low-level alertness that wild animals carry through their bodies even at rest. Why would a wild creature move across an open road without even the smallest trace of caution? Wild animals are always, on some level, listening. Even the ones at the top of the food chain have something residual in them, some background process running beneath behavior, keeping a loose inventory of the environment. Bigfoot had none of that. It moved through the space the way you move through your own house in the dark, unhurried and unafraid, because every part of the space is already known. This was the pace of something that knew exactly where it was going and had no particular reason to rush. At 18 seconds, Bigfoot slowed, just slightly, and its head turned, not toward the camera, toward the staging area ahead, where the machine sat in the fading afternoon light at the edge of the cleared ground. It held that angle for about 2 seconds, then turned back and kept walking. The motion was so specific and so calm that Stellan watched it 3 times before he allowed himself to move on. Not assessment, not curiosity. It already knew the machine was there. The head turn was something else, the particular quality of attention you give to something you have been thinking about for a while and are now almost close enough to reach. Stellan had seen that quality in human subjects on surveillance footage. He had not expected to see it here. At 31 seconds, the service road passed under a gap in the canopy where a large tree had come down at some point, and the wider beam of light that came through that gap caught the hair across Bigfoot's shoulders in detail. Individual strands moved in a faint breeze, each at its own speed, the longer ones catching more air and moving further, the shorter ones barely shifting. It was the movement of real hair on a living body, not costume material, not anything synthetic, but actual biological material, each strand independent, responding to a small amount of air moving through the forest the way any animal's coat would respond to it. Stellan had worked enough wildlife cases to know what hair looked like on a large animal in natural light, and what he was seeing in those 2 seconds matched that in a way that he could not argue himself out of. It kept walking. The bulldozer was visible now at the far right margin of the camera's field. The wide blade, the upper cab structure, the bulk of the machine sitting exactly where the crew had left it. Bigfoot moved into the cleared staging ground, and the camera held its full profile. The cone-shaped skull, the heavy brow ridge above the flat face, the wide shoulders rolling forward in that consistent stride. It was still moving without any change of pace. It had not slowed. It had not stopped to evaluate. Whatever it intended to do when it reached that machine, the decision was already behind it, made and settled somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, not something it was still working out as it crossed the open ground. If the decision had already been made hours earlier, what had convinced it that the bulldozer needed to be dealt with? At 45 seconds, Bigfoot stopped. The stop was total, not a slow deceleration, not a shift of weight, but an immediate halt, the way a body stops when it has arrived at the thing it came for. It was standing at the front of the bulldozer. The machine came up to roughly its mid-chest. Stellan had the dimensions of a bulldozer memorized from the case file. Operating weight around 20,000 pounds. Blade width 14 feet. Cab height just under 10 feet to the exhaust stack. He held those numbers in his head and looked at the Sasquatch standing in front of it and felt something happen in the back of his mind that was not comfortable. Then the head turned, not toward the machine, toward the camera. It found the lens with the same precision it had found its destination, directly, without a search, without the half-second of scanning that would have been present if it hadn't already known where to look. Bigfoot's eyes found the lens and held it. How long had it known the camera was there before it decided to look at it? The expression on the face was not what he would have expected. There was no startle in it, no alarm, none of the wide-eye tension that comes through clearly on any large mammal when it encounters something unexpected. The expression was flat, unreadable in the specific way that a face becomes unreadable when the emotion behind it is something unfamiliar. Not the absence of expression, but an expression that had no match in anything Stellan knew how to read. If the creature wasn't surprised by the camera or the machine, then what exactly had it come here expecting to find? If he had to name it, and he resisted doing so, he would have called it acknowledgement. The eye contact lasted 3 seconds. Midway through those 3 seconds, there was a small movement in the irises, a slight shift in the direction of gaze, not dramatic, not a full look away, but the micro-movement that happens when a brain is actively working behind the eyes. Bigfoot was not staring, not frozen, but processing the camera with the same deliberate efficiency it had applied to everything else in its path. Whatever the camera represented, the evaluation was brief. It had been located, classified, and deprioritized in the span of 3 seconds, and then it was simply no longer the focus. That kind of response, finding a thing, deciding about it, continuing, is not the behavior of instinct. Instinct is louder and less precise. What happened at 45 seconds was a decision. After 3 seconds, Bigfoot turned back to the machine. Stellan stayed on the frame. The moment just after the eye contact ended and the Sasquatch turned its attention back to the bulldozer. For a long time, the way you stay on a frame when some part of you is hoping the pause will give the image somewhere else to go. He had reviewed hundreds of hours of trail camera footage over 11 years. He had seen wildlife, vandals, trespassers, livestock. He had a working vocabulary for what human damage looked like and what animal damage looked like and where the boundary between them sat. He had never once, in 11 years, expected to need a category on the other side of both of those things at once. If the answer to the bulldozer damage didn't fit human behavior or animal behavior, what exactly had Stellan been hired to investigate? At 59 seconds, it started. Bigfoot placed both hands against the front blade of the dozer. Not a strike, a placement, deliberate and measured, with the flat of both palms against the upper edge of the steel, fingers curling slightly over the lip. There was no wind-up. There was no gathering of effort, no widening of the stance, no visible bracing. The body didn't shift. It just applied force, and the blade moved. Stellan watched it and thought about the numbers. To move something that heavy from a standing position with no leverage, no running start, no equipment of any kind. Through the application of hand pressure alone, he could not finish the calculation in a way that came out as possible. He watched it happen on the screen anyway. The machine rocked backward. Not dramatically, not a catastrophic lurch, a single authoritative rock, the tracks on the far side lifting a few inches off the ground before the weight came back down. The settling impact when it came back down was audible on the microphone. Bigfoot had not moved. Its feet were in the same position. Its posture was the same. It had pushed 20,000 pounds backward a measurable distance without leaning into it, and whatever that had cost it was not visible anywhere on its body. Then it gripped the blade and pulled. The sound the microphone captured at 1 minute and 4 seconds was not a sound Stellan had a reference for. It was metal under stress, the particular dense, tearing quality of structural steel separating at points it was not designed to separate at, layered over a lower, sustained groan that was the frame of the machine responding to a force it had not been engineered to withstand. If the frame of the bulldozer was already failing under the strain, how much more of it could the creature take apart? The blade came away in 2 pieces. The first piece went somewhere to the left, out of frame. The second piece the Sasquatch held in one hand, examined briefly in the way you examine a thing that has just come apart in a manner that surprises you slightly, and then set down on the ground beside the machine with a precision that was almost careful. He replayed those 4 seconds 6 times. What he was looking for, what part of his brain kept insisting had to be there, was some visible exertion in the body, some shift of the hips, some drop of the shoulder, some change of breath visible in the chest or the rib cage. In any large animal under load, you can read the effort. The spine curves toward the resistance. The legs drive into the ground. Something moves that tells you the body is working against something that requires working against. None of that was present. The Sasquatch had removed a steel blade from a 20,000-pound dozer, and the only thing that changed in its body was the position of its arms. Stellan had no explanation for that. He had no framework that could hold it. He just watched it again, and the footage kept showing him the same thing it had shown him every previous time. If the evidence refused to change, no matter how many times he replayed it, how was he supposed to explain it to the people who had hired him? He looked at the paused frame on his laptop screen, the machine with its blade gone, the Sasquatch standing beside it with what had been solid welded structural steel lying in 2 pieces in the gravel, and thought about every equipment damage case he had worked that ended with a clear explanation, and how none of them had pointed anywhere near here. Most equipment damage in wilderness had one of 4 causes: vandalism, weather, mechanical failure, or transportation accident. He had never once, in 11 years, needed a 5th category. He sat in the truck for probably 2 minutes without moving, and then he started the clip again. Bigfoot moved down the left side of the machine. The same unhurried gait, the same absence of urgency, walking the length of the dozer the way a person walks the length of something they are inspecting and taking inventory of. At the track assembly, it stopped and crouched, and Stellan lost the upper body to the camera angle, and then there was a sound like a rifle shot, and the camera image shook from the vibration of it, and when the Sasquatch stood back up and kept walking, it was carrying a section of track chain that weighed, by Stellan's later estimate, somewhere between 400 and 500 pounds. It carried it one-handed, the chain hanging in a loose loop from its fist, swinging slightly with each stride in the way things swing when they are being carried by something that does not find their weight particularly notable. It stood at the far end of the machine and held still. It had done something deliberate, and now it was simply standing with the chain at its side, upright and without any shift of weight, in the specific stillness that is different from rest. Not the stillness of something that has stopped because it is tired. The stillness of something that has stopped because it is done with one part and is now considering the next. If this was only one step in a process, what part of the machine would it decide to remove next? The force required to produce what the microphone had captured was not something he could talk himself past. He had worked enough outdoor cases to have a working understanding of what a large body in motion sounds like when it connects with a solid surface, when it bends steel, when it removes load-bearing components from machinery designed to operate in the harshest available terrain. What he had heard from 1 minute and 4 seconds onward was not close to anything a human being was capable of producing without cutting equipment, without time, without preparation of any kind. The effort simply did not register on the Sasquatch's body. Nothing changed in its face. Nothing changed in its posture. It had torn the blade off a 20,000-pound machine and removed a section of track assembly and was now holding 500 pounds of chain in one fist, with the same affect as someone holding a set of car keys. It swung what it had removed as if this required roughly the same amount of attention as opening a door, and then it stood and looked at the rest of the machine, and the expression on its face was the particular blankness of something that is deciding what comes next. If removing a bulldozer blade registered the same way opening a door did, what would actually constitute effort for something like this? The waiting was the part that resisted any clean explanation. This was not random destruction. It was not territorial aggression in any documented form. It was not feeding behavior. It was something that looked, from the outside, like work. A job being done with professional composure by something that knew exactly what it was doing and had no need to rush through it. Bigfoot had arrived at a specific machine and was working through it with the methodical attention of something that had a clear idea of what it wanted the end state to look like. All of that had the shape of intention, of a plan formed somewhere else in the dark and the quiet of this forest, and now simply being executed one component at a time with no wasted motion and no visible exertion. Stellan had been on enough investigative calls to know the difference between damage caused by force and damage caused by intention. Force leaves patterns that are directional and predictable. The vectors of an impact, the trajectory of a slide, the failure points of metal stressed beyond its rating. Intention leaves patterns that are selective. A machine stripped of specific components, left in a specific condition, arranged in a way that suggests the end state was the objective from the beginning. What Camera 4 had captured had the shape of intention, from the moment the Sasquatch placed its palms against the blade to the moment it stood with the track chain in its fist. And it was the most unsettling thing Stellan had encountered in 11 years of work that occasionally turned up unsettling things. He thought about that while he watched the clip a second time. The components had been removed in a sequence that made a kind of structural sense. The blade first, which bore the weight of the forward end. The track section next, which compromised the machine's mobility. If you wanted to disable a bulldozer permanently, if you wanted to render it irreparable rather than merely inoperative, that was roughly the order in which a knowledgeable person would work. He did not know what to do with the implication of that. He set it to the side and kept watching. If the sequence mirrored how a trained operator would disable a machine, how did the Sasquatch know where to start? At 1 minute and 14 seconds, the tree line on the far side of the staging area moved. Not the way wind moves a tree line, not a general wave-like shift of branches and upper canopy. The movement was low and specific, the kind that comes from a large body pushing through dense brush, and it happened at a single point in the tree line directly across the staging area from where Bigfoot stood. A second Sasquatch stepped out. Stellan's first impression was size, and his second impression was that his first impression had been wrong because he had used the first Bigfoot as his baseline for large. The second Sasquatch was bigger, noticeably, significantly bigger. He estimated somewhere between 9.5 and 10 feet, broader across the chest and shoulders, the coat darker, almost black in the shadows at the edge of the staging area, and shifting toward a very deep brown, only when it moved far enough into the light. Each step carried a mass that was visible in the way the ground responded, in the way the gravel compressed and shifted with each footfall. If the first one had already dismantled part of the machine alone, what could the larger one do when it reached it? It moved directly to the dozer cab. No inspection, no pause. It gripped the cab structure at the roofline with both hands, and what it did next happened in the same quiet, businesslike way everything had happened since the first Bigfoot walked into frame. The cab came off the frame, not twisted, not folded, separated cleanly at the mounting points, lifted away from the machine as a unit, and set down on the far side of the clearing with the same considered placement the first Sasquatch had used when it set down the blade section. The roll cage was still intact, the seat was still inside it. The whole assembly sat upright on the gravel, and the machine beneath it was open to the sky, its internal workings exposed to the forest air, as if the cab had simply been removed for maintenance by someone who knew exactly which bolts to pull. The two Sasquatches stood in the staging area and faced what remained of the dozer. There was no sound between them on the microphone, no vocalization, no clicking, no signal of any kind. They stood in the remaining light with the stripped machine between them, and they were still, and whatever was happening between them did not require sound. If they weren't communicating out loud, how had they coordinated the work so precisely? Then the larger one looked up. It found the camera immediately. The head came up, and the eyes went directly to the lens without a scan, without a search, without the delay that would have been present if it didn't already know where to look. It held eye contact for 3 seconds, the same duration as the first Sasquatch, and the expression Stellan saw on its face across that brief span of footage was not curiosity. It was not alarm. It was something that he kept turning over in his mind on the drive back south and could not find a better word for than acknowledgement. Not surprise that the camera was there, not aggression toward it, something closer to the look a person gives when they notice they are being watched and want you to know they noticed. The clip ended. 99 seconds of footage, and Stellan had no idea what to do with any of it. If the creatures knew they were being watched, had the camera captured exactly what they wanted someone to see? The Halverson equipment had been at that site for 3 weeks. Whatever had been decided about it had been decided somewhere in that window, in the old-growth forest above the staging area, in the dark, with no documentation of any kind, no record of the deliberation, no way to read the outcome, until Camera 4 picked up the result in 1 minute and 39 seconds of footage. This was not a territorial behavior that happened to be caught on camera. It was a territorial behavior that was delivered to one. They had not been surprised by his equipment. They had used it. The destruction was not something that Stellan's investigation had uncovered. It was something that had been staged for his investigation, or for whoever came after him, or for the footage to eventually reach whoever at the Halverson Timber Company had the authority to decide whether the machines went back in. Jodie Shelby was 23 years old. She had thousands of followers on TikTok, a content niche built entirely around going places people told her not to go, and a personal policy of never reading the comments that said, "Turn around." In 2 years of doing this, she had never once encountered anything that made her regret being somewhere. She drove into a vast stretch of old-growth national forest in southern Washington state on a Friday afternoon in late September with a fully charged phone, a backup battery clipped to her belt, and a video already planned in her head. She had done this enough times that the planning was automatic. Find the place, drive to the place, walk in alone, keep the camera running, let the audience decide what was interesting. The formula had never failed her. She started recording at 4:47 p.m. and posted to her story before she left the car. By the time she was 40 minutes into the trail, she had 11,000 people watching a young woman walk alone into a forest that had no maintained paths, no cell coverage past the first mile, and no record of anyone having come through that particular drainage in a very long time. None of those 11,000 people knew what they were about to watch. Neither did she. The forest covered nearly 1 million acres, old-growth Douglas fir and western hemlock pressing in tight on either side of roads that stopped having names after the first few miles. Jodie had pulled her location from a hiking forum thread and driven 3 hours to reach it. She parked at the end of a Forest Service road where a rusted gate blocked further vehicle access, and a sign informed visitors that the trail beyond it was unmaintained and not recommended for solo travel. She filmed the sign from 3 angles and posted it to her story. The trail she followed north from the gate ran along the left bank of a creek loud enough in the drainage to swallow most ambient sound. The canopy was dense, afternoon light coming down in broken columns. She was filming vertically, phone at chest height, talking to her audience with the specific cadence of someone who has decided the most interesting thing about any situation is how unbothered they are by it. She was not reading the terrain, the fresh scat at the 20-minute mark, the bent creek grass where something large had recently come through, the bird noise that had been present for the first 15 minutes and was now completely gone. Bigfoot had been in this drainage long before she arrived. The bent grass at the creek edge was his. The silence where the birds had been was his. Bigfoot had been moving parallel to the trail since before she passed the 20-minute mark, tracking her through the tree line at a distance she could not see, and making no sound the microphone could isolate from the creek and canopy. He was not hiding. He was observing. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Something hiding reduces itself, pulls back, makes itself smaller. What Bigfoot was doing in that drainage was the opposite. Bigfoot was present and patient, and already in full possession of the situation. He had been watching people enter this drainage for longer than anyone had been documenting it, and he had made his own assessment of her before she reached the 20-minute mark. Jodie was the variable. Bigfoot was not. Bigfoot moved through old growth in near total silence when he chose to. What made him visible, the bent grass, the displaced creek bank, the scat she walked past without registering, was not carelessness. It was record. Bigfoot had been through this drainage recently and often, and the terrain carried the evidence of that the way terrain carries the evidence of anything that uses it regularly. The fresh track she would find later, pointing south, pointed toward her because Bigfoot had been walking south when he made it. He had been walking south, and then he had heard her car on the Forest Service road, and he had stopped and assessed and changed direction. By the time she passed through the gate, Bigfoot had already been moving toward her for the better part of an hour. She had been walking toward him the whole time without knowing it. He had been walking toward her the whole time, knowing exactly what he was walking toward. At the 31-minute mark, she said it felt like something knew she was there. She said it lightly, framing it as content, the kind of thing you say in a dark forest because saying it out loud makes it smaller. Bigfoot had known she was there from the moment she stepped through the gate. He had been generating the exact signal she was reading, the particular pressure that a large, intelligent animal produces when it has fixed its full attention on something. It is not a sound and not a smell and not any single identifiable input. It is the aggregate effect of being watched by something that is not hiding and not afraid, and is giving you its complete attention from a distance close enough that your body registers it before your mind does. She had been walking under that pressure for 31 minutes. Her body had finally surfaced it as language. She framed it as content and kept walking, and Bigfoot kept pace with her through the tree line and said nothing. At the 43-minute mark, she stopped talking mid-sentence. The creek had gone quiet. Not quiet on its own. Bigfoot had stopped moving, and the focused stillness of something that large in that proximity had taken over the frequency her brain had been filtering for ambient noise. She stood on the trail for 6 seconds without speaking. Then, without the performed cadence, she said that something smelled wrong. That smell was Bigfoot? He was already close enough that the air between them had changed. She turned the camera north, up the trail, and held it there. In the upper right corner of the frame, Bigfoot moved. Not a branch, not a shadow. Bigfoot crossed the top right of the frame from east to west, moving through the tree line at a speed inconsistent with any ground animal that size. Fluid and unhurried, covering ground the way something moves when it has decided to reposition. He was in the frame for under a second. The camera dropped 2 inches in her hand, the involuntary response of a grip that changed before her conscious mind made any decision. She said something was there. Flat. No question in it. That was the moment the performed cadence left her voice for good. The viewer count climbed to 13,000. She turned north and kept walking. Bigfoot was north. North was where the footage was. She walked for 4 more minutes as the canopy thickened and the afternoon light failed, and the shadows between the trees went from dark to black. She switched on her phone's flashlight, and the beam caught the trail in a narrow column, the tree line pressing in at arm's length on both sides. At 4 minutes and 22 seconds, she stopped. Bigfoot's track was in the soil below the flashlight beam. Pressed deep enough that the edges were clean and vertical, the way edges are when significant weight has displaced wet ground. She placed her hand inside it, palm flat, fingers spread. Her hand fit inside it with room on every side. 5-toed, symmetrical, heel pad broader than her entire hand. Not a bear, not anything with a name she had ever used. The soil at the edges had not yet dried. Bigfoot had made this track recently enough that when she crouched over it, Bigfoot was somewhere nearby, watching her do it. The track was pointing south, toward her. Bigfoot had been walking in her direction when he made it. She stood and turned north. The comments went completely silent. Not fewer, none. 13,000 people reading the same dark frame and not typing a word. Then the smell arrived again, not faint. Full and immediate, already everywhere, which meant Bigfoot had repositioned while she was crouching and was now close. Close in the way something is close when the air between you and it is already saturated and there is no meaningful distance left. Bigfoot had moved while her attention was on the track. He had used the 40 seconds she spent crouching over his footprint to close the distance between them, and now the air in every direction her flashlight could reach was already carrying him. She gagged on camera, her free hand coming up to her face. At 4 minutes and 51 seconds, the tree line on the right side of the trail moved, not the canopy. Ground level, a single specific displacement of dense brush approximately 20 feet ahead. The kind that happens when something large pushes through it deliberately, not passing through, arriving. Bigfoot had moved to the edge of the trail and stopped. The brush settled. The tree line was still. Bigfoot was standing inside it at the edge of the trail in the dark, and the distance between them was 20 feet, and the only thing between them was the beam of her flashlight. The viewer count climbed to 16,000. She held the camera forward and watched. 3 seconds of nothing, and then, in the dark space between two fir trunks, Bigfoot became visible. Not movement, presence, the specific quality of darkness that is different from the darkness around it because it has edges, because it is not the absence of light, but the obstruction of it. Bigfoot filled the space between those trunks from ground level to above where the flashlight beam reached, blocking the depth behind him, holding his edges steady against the movement of the foliage on either side. He occupied that space the way solid objects occupy space, with mass and depth and the stillness of something that is not reacting to anything. The comments went to single words: real, there, God, in 3 languages at once. Bigfoot was still, not the frozen stillness of something surprised, the settled, patient stillness of something that has decided to be exactly where it is. Bigfoot had chosen this spot and this moment with the same economy he had applied to every movement since she entered the drainage. He had moved parallel to this trail for the better part of an hour, and he had repositioned twice, and he had left a track pointing directly at her, and now he was standing between 2 fir trunks at the edge of the trail, and there was nothing in his posture that indicated any of this had been anything other than entirely intentional. Bigfoot was in no hurry because nothing in this drainage required him to hurry. Not the dark, not the terrain, not her. She whispered that there was something there. 16,000 people, and none of them typed a word. She stepped toward him, then again. Bigfoot did not move. He did not retreat. He stood in that shadow and let her come, and what the flashlight beam caught at the edge of him, where his mass met the lighter dark beside the fir trunk, was dense dark hair, a shoulder broader than the space between the trunks should have allowed. The absolute solidity of something that was not a trick of light and had never been. A fine, continuous tremor had started in the frame. Her hand, barely visible but consistent, present in every frame from this point forward. She took one more step, and Bigfoot stepped out of the tree line. He came forward in a single unhurried step, and the flashlight beam caught the lower half of him, mid-torso down, because the upper half of Bigfoot was above the beam's angle. The beam was not built for something that tall. Dense, layered hair with the independent strand movement of actual animal coat. His feet bare on the trail soil, each one broader than the flashlight beam was wide, matching exactly the track pressed into the earth behind her. His legs built around proportions that had no category. Not a large human, not a bear on its hind legs, something with no entry in anything she had ever seen. She stumbled backward. The camera shook hard and then steadied on Bigfoot standing in the partial illumination of her flashlight 15 feet in front of her. Bigfoot was not moving. She said he was real. 3 words. He stood where he stood, the upper half of him above the beam, and there was no aggression in his posture and no retreat. Bigfoot had stepped out of the tree line in full view of her camera without hesitation and without alarm. He knew she was there. He had always known, and now he was letting her know that he knew, standing 15 feet in front of her in the dark, completely still, in no hurry because hurrying was not something this drainage had ever required of him. Bigfoot had been here for years, perhaps decades. In all of that time, nothing had walked north up this trail and pointed a light at him. He was looking at something new. He was in no hurry to be anywhere else. The only sounds in the drainage were the creek and the wind and 16,000 people doing nothing. Bigfoot stood. The flashlight beam held the lower half of him, and the upper half occupied darkness above it, and Bigfoot did not shift his weight and did not adjust his position and was not performing stillness. He simply had no reason to move. He had made his decision before he stepped out of the tree line, and the decision had been made with full information. He had watched her for the better part of an hour. He had let her find his track. He had moved to the edge of the trail and let her hear the brush, and then stood in the gap between the trunks and let her see his mass, and then stepped out and let the full reality of him reach her at whatever pace it needed to. Every step of this had been Bigfoot's. Every beat of the encounter had been Bigfoot's. And now he was standing 15 feet in front of her on the trail he used, in the drainage he owned, letting her look at what she had come north to find. Then Bigfoot turned, a single unhurried rotation, and began to walk north. Not fleeing, not retreating. Bigfoot walked north up the trail with the same economy he had shown since stepping out of the tree line, covering ground the way something moves when it owns every inch of it. The flashlight caught the back of him, the breadth of his shoulders above the beam's angle, the dense layered hair, the stride of something whose proportions her eyes kept failing to translate. He was still in her beam, and the comments exploded. She followed him. 2 years of pattern made the choice before she did. She walked north, and Bigfoot held himself at the edge of her flashlight's reach. Never closer, never further, as though he was calibrating the gap between them without effort. Every few seconds, the beam caught a piece of him. The back of a heel broader than both her feet, combined pressing into the soft trail soil, the shoulder moving above the angle, the hair at the beam's edge throwing nothing back. Bigfoot was not looking at her. He was walking north and letting her follow, and that was its own transaction, different from the first one, where Bigfoot had stood still and let her come to him. This one was in motion. This one required her to keep moving to stay in it. Bigfoot set the pace. Bigfoot held the distance. Bigfoot was leading her north through his drainage, and she was following because that was what the camera required, and because the alternative was standing alone in the dark on a trail she no longer trusted to be empty in any direction. The viewer count climbed to 22,000. Bigfoot stopped. He was standing at the edge of the flashlight's reach, his back to her, facing something on the trail. She moved the beam and saw what Bigfoot was standing beside, a section of old-growth fir trunk, 4 feet in diameter, lying across the trail. The break point was pale and raw, freshly broken timber, fiber not yet oxidized. The root ball at the far end was still partially in the ground. The trunk had not fallen from the base. Bigfoot had separated it from itself at a point approximately 8 feet above the ground, and the break point was smooth. Smooth the way material is smooth when enormous focused force has been applied faster than fiber has time to tear unevenly. Bigfoot had done this. Bigfoot had placed his hands on a living 4-foot fir 8 feet above the ground and applied force to it until it broke. And the break was clean because the force had been sufficient and controlled and delivered by something that knew exactly how much it would take. Nothing else in that drainage could have made it. Nothing else in those woods was capable of it. Bigfoot stood beside it, facing north, not looking at her. She put her hand against the break point. When she stood, Bigfoot had not moved. He was on the north side of the trunk, the flashlight on the lower half of him, looking up the drainage into dark the camera could not reach. The comments had stopped entirely. A boundary. Bigfoot had made it. Everything south of this trunk was where the encounter had happened. Everything north was his, and Bigfoot was standing on the north side of it, still visible, still present, waiting to see what she would do. She stepped over the trunk. The moment her second foot cleared the wood, Bigfoot turned his head, not his body, just his head, rotating back over his shoulder, and the flashlight caught the edge of his face for the first time. Jaw, cheekbone, the profile of something that was not a bear and not a man. He held that angle for 2 full seconds. Then Bigfoot turned back north and began to walk again. Faster. The trail beyond the trunk was narrower, the brush closing in, the canopy solid above. The flashlight held Bigfoot at the edge of its reach. Still visible, the back of him moving through the narrowing dark ahead, but covering ground now at a pace that required her to work to keep the beam on him. She was watching the shape in the beam ahead of her, the only fixed point in a drainage that had gone completely black around her, keeping up because losing Bigfoot to the dark meant being left alone in a forest she now understood differently than she had an hour ago. Bigfoot ahead of her in the beam was better than Bigfoot somewhere behind her in the dark. She kept up. The viewer count was at 26,000. The smell arrived all at once. Full and immediate, already everywhere, already saturated. Bigfoot was still ahead of her in the beam, still moving, but the intervals of his stride had changed. She had been following a pace. Now she was following something that was no longer managing the distance between them. Bigfoot stopped. He stopped and turned fully in the middle of the trail, and for the first time he was facing her completely. The full front of him in the flashlight beam, closer now than the first encounter. His feet bare on the trail soil, each broader than the beam was wide. His legs built around proportions that had no category. His posture was different from what it had been when he first stepped out of the tree line. Not the settled, patient stillness of something at the center of its comfort. This was the stillness of something that has made a decision and is giving what is in front of it exactly 1 moment to understand that decision before acting on it. She took 1 step backward. Bigfoot took 1 step forward. She turned and ran. The camera swung at her side, catching the trail in fragments. Flashes of the flashlight beam hitting the ground. The creek on the left, the tree line blurring past. And beneath her footfalls and her breathing, the microphone picked up Bigfoot, a low rhythmic concussion arriving at intervals that corresponded to a stride length no human being produces. Each impact registered as a compression the microphone had not been built to capture cleanly. Not a footfall in any human sense, but a displacement, the sound of significant weight transferred to ground at speed. Bigfoot was behind her, not far behind her, closing steadily without urgency, the way something closes when it knows the terrain in the dark and has already decided how this ends. Bigfoot was not chasing her because she had startled him. Bigfoot was not chasing her the way a threatened animal chases. Bigfoot was covering ground between himself and someone who had crossed a line he had placed there, with the focused efficiency of something returning what had crossed the boundary to the other side of it. He was not running at full capacity. The intervals between his footfalls were not the intervals of something extended. Bigfoot was running her back to the trunk at a pace that was sufficient, and no more. A controlled return, the same controlled economy he had applied to everything since the moment he heard her car on the Forest Service road. Even now, even in motion, even in the dark of a drainage that was entirely his, Bigfoot was not reacting. He was executing. She ran harder. The concussive rhythm of Bigfoot's stride filled the drainage, each impact heavier than the last as the ground between them shrank. Bigfoot was closing the gap faster than she was opening it, and the drainage was long, and the gate was far. The camera went dark, knocked against her side, or the battery finally surrendering, and she kept running in total darkness, the flashlight forward, the sound of Bigfoot behind her filling everything. The darkness made no difference to him. The dark was his. The terrain was his. Every advantage belonged to Bigfoot, and she ran anyway because running was the only variable left that was hers. She hit the fallen trunk at full speed and cleared it without breaking stride. At the exact moment she crossed it, Bigfoot screamed, not behind her, at her. The sound came from directly behind the trunk, and it filled the drainage completely. Not an animal sound in any register she had a word for, not the call of anything in any forest she had ever entered. It was enormous and close, and it arrived with such force that the microphone distorted, the audio peaking and clipping in the recording. Bigfoot was at the boundary. Bigfoot was at the exact line he had placed there, the line he had broken a 4-foot fir to mark, and he was at it and not crossing it, and the sound he was making at it was not a warning and not a threat in any language she could have named. It was a declaration. Bigfoot declaring the boundary in the only register that left no room for interpretation. A sound built to travel, built to stop, built to establish without any possibility of confusion the exact line past which nothing was going to follow. The kind of sound that has one meaning in any language, in any species, in any forest on Earth. Then Bigfoot stopped, all at once. The drainage went from full, every inch of it carrying Bigfoot's voice, to completely silent in a single frame. Just the creek and the wind and her own breathing and the trail widening ahead toward the gate. Bigfoot had stopped at the exact boundary he had drawn. He had run her to the line, and at the line he had made himself heard, and then he had let her go. She did not stop. She ran until the trail widened and the canopy opened, and the gate was ahead of her in the flashlight beam. She hit it at full speed, pulled herself through, got in the car, and pulled the door shut. She sat in the driver's seat for 43 seconds without speaking, breathing the way a person breathes when they are still deciding whether they are alive. The gate was 40-plus minutes of trail from where Bigfoot had started closing behind her, and she had covered it in the dark with him behind her, and she was in the car, and the door was shut. She had not looked back once. She did not look back now. She stared at the gate and the dark beyond it, and she breathed, and the recording kept running because she had never once stopped the recording. The drainage beyond the gate was silent. Whatever Bigfoot had decided after she crossed the boundary, he had decided it on the north side of the trunk and stayed there. The forest was the forest again. Creek, wind, canopy. 40 minutes of trail and a broken fir and a scream that had peaked the microphone, and then nothing. Bigfoot had made his point. Bigfoot had made it clearly and at close range, and in a register that required no interpretation. And then Bigfoot had gone back to whatever he had been doing before a car arrived on a Forest Service road and changed his afternoon. Then she looked at the camera. She said 2 things. First, that Bigfoot had broken that tree, that nothing breaks old-growth timber 8 feet above the ground and leaves the break point smooth, and that nothing capable of that had any business being in those woods. And second, that Bigfoot had stopped at it. She had crossed the trunk and Bigfoot had screamed and then gone silent, all at once, and she had not looked back, and the drainage behind her had been empty the rest of the way to the gate. Bigfoot had run her back to the line he had drawn, told her clearly what he was in a voice that left no room for argument, and stopped there. The line held. Everything south of it was hers. Everything north was his. She ended the recording. Doug Blanchett was 4 miles deep into a solo patrol on a ridge trail in a stretch of backcountry forest in the Pacific Northwest. Remote enough that the nearest road was 2 hours behind him on foot, quiet enough that he had not seen another person since the trailhead. He has worked in this territory for 11 years. The morning was overcast and cold, the light flat and gray through the canopy, the air holding that deep smell of damp soil and pine resin that the forest gets in late September when the season is starting to turn. He had the handheld camera out because he was documenting erosion damage along the trail edge for a maintenance report. He had been out there 100 times in conditions exactly like this. However, he did not hear the dogman coming. One moment the footage shows the forest was empty. The next, something exploded out of the tree line 15 feet to his left, already moving at full speed, already aimed directly at him, and Doug's body understood what it was seeing about 3 full seconds before his mind caught up. What does a man do when his instincts realize he is about to die before his brain can even process what is chasing him? The footage showed that it was bipedal. It ran on 2 legs, but the mechanics were wrong. The lower legs were too long, the stride too fast, the whole motion, like something familiar, played at the wrong speed. It was close to 7 feet tall and covered in dark brown fur that was slick and matted at the shoulders. And its face was a dog's face, not a mask, not an approximation, an actual canine snout, long and tapered, with actual canine ears rotating toward him as it ran, reading him. The hands were not paws. They had fingers, long ones, with dark hooked nails that curved like they had been designed specifically for holding something down. The whole creature moved with the absolute, unhurried certainty of a predator that has already decided how this ends. Doug ran. There is no other word for what he did, and no version of events in which a different choice makes more sense. He turned and ran northeast along the trail, hard and fast, and he dropped the handheld camera within the first 2 strides. The footage from those seconds shows the trail lurching sideways, then a spinning view of pine needles and sky, then stillness, a sideways shot of the trail, and nothing else. Doug circled back and grabbed it 8 seconds later. 8 seconds, sprinting back toward the thing that was chasing him, scooping the camera off the ground without breaking stride. But he was running, and behind him, the dogman was gaining. You could hear it in the footage's audio. Not footsteps, something heavier than footsteps, a rhythmic concussive impact as 350 pounds of predator ate up the distance between them in long, wrong-jointed strides. It was not hurrying, that was the worst part. Even at full sprint, Doug could hear that the thing behind him was not at its limit. It was pacing itself, enjoying it maybe, or maybe just so far beyond him in terms of raw capability that hurrying was beside the point. He made 40 yards, maybe 45. Then the dogman hit him from behind. How far can a human actually run when the predator chasing him is not even trying yet? The impact was total and catastrophic. Shoulder height, full weight, full speed, and Doug went down face up with no memory of the transition between running and being on the ground. The body camera took a hard knock and tilted about 20 degrees, and every frame of footage after that moment has a slightly canted angle, sky in the wrong place, trees leaning like the whole world had been subtly rotated off its axis. His arms were pinned under the creature's knees. His legs could move, but the math on kicking a 400-pound predator from flat on his back was not good math. He tried anyway. Then he stopped trying, because stopping was what his body decided, not him. His body ran the numbers faster than his brain and came back with the only answer that made sense, which was that this was over and struggling was just going to make whatever came next worse. What does a man do when every survival instinct suddenly tells him that fighting will only make his death slower? He went still. The forest was quiet above him. He could hear his own pulse and the faint sound of wind in the high canopy, and nothing else. He could see sky through the branches. He could see the dogman's head blocking part of that sky, its dark ears upright, its eyes looking down at him with an expression that was worse than hunger. Something patient and certain and totally without doubt. The dogman did not thrash, did not snarl. It settled its weight onto him with the calm precision of something that had done this before, that knew exactly how much pressure to apply and where to apply it. And the stillness of it was so much worse than frenzy would have been. Frenzy Doug could have understood. Frenzy meant panic, meant mistakes, meant the possibility that something would go wrong for the thing on top of him. This was not frenzy. This was control. How do you escape something that is not making mistakes? The dogman lowered its head, slowly. People always flinch when Doug describes the slowness, because they expect fast. They expect the snap in the darkness and the merciful brevity of something violent. But it wasn't fast. The head came down in a long, deliberate arc, and the jaws opened, and the snout was longer up close than distance had suggested, and the teeth were very white and very large, and Doug could feel the warmth radiating off the inside of the mouth before it even touched him, like standing too close to something that was burning. Then the jaws closed around his skull. The upper jaw pressed across his forehead, and the lower jaw settled under his chin, and he could feel the points of every tooth finding their place against his skin with a horrible, intimate delicacy. The warmth surrounded his entire head. Every muscle in his body let go at once. He lay there in the dark inside those jaws, and he waited. And the waiting was its own kind of horror, a suspended moment that seemed to stretch and stretch without ever arriving at the end of itself, and he thought with terrible clarity, "This is it. How long can a moment last when you are waiting for something to crush your skull? Then in the camera, you could hear something hit the ground hard enough that Doug felt it through his spine. It came up through the earth and into his back like a shockwave. Not a sound first, but a physical event, a deep concussive pulse that traveled through solid rock and soil and arrived in his chest like a fist. Then the sound followed, a massive low boom, and then another, slow and rhythmic and absolute. Something enormous was beating a tree against the earth somewhere to the northwest, and whatever it was not small, and it was getting closer, and the dogman above him had gone completely, suddenly, terribly still. The dogman held its position. Doug could feel it inhale, one long, controlled pull of air through the nose, tasting what was coming. And somewhere above him, its ears shifted, rotating toward the sound, the way a radar dish rotates toward a signal. The whole creature seemed to recalibrate, the weight on Doug's arms changing slightly as it straightened, attention moving away from him and toward something else entirely. What kind of presence can make a predator forget the prey already trapped beneath it? Then the jaws opened, and Doug could breathe again. He lay on the ground and stared up at the canopy while the dogman stood over him, and the forest beyond the tree line kept shaking with those slow, massive impacts, and he turned his head. At the edge of the camera's frame, Bigfoot was seen stepping through a gap between two old-growth firs at the edge of the clearing, and Doug's first thought, the thought that hit him before any rational response could form, was that his sense of scale was simply broken, that what he was seeing could not occupy the space it appeared to occupy, that the world did not make things this large, that walked upright and breathed and had eyes that moved. If the creature that just tried to kill you is afraid of something else, how big must that something be? 9.5 feet? Maybe more. The shoulders were wider than Doug's full arm span, the arms themselves hanging with the knuckles at mid-thigh, even fully upright, and the fur was almost black, dense and heavy-looking, matted in thick ridges across the back and shoulders like armor that had grown there over decades. Every step it took landed with a weight that the ground registered, not shaking the earth, not theatrically, but registering a subtle compression, a slight give, because the weight behind each footfall was simply that significant. Each exhale came out as vapor in the cold air. It smelled of deep forest and something older and stranger, something that had no category in any system of classification Doug had ever learned. It moved without urgency, without hesitation, without any suggestion that the distance between itself and whatever it had come here for was anything other than already settled. It was the most terrifying thing Doug had ever seen, and it was not even looking at him. It was not looking at Doug. He was lying directly between it and the dogman, and Bigfoot looked straight through him, not around him, through him, the way someone looks through a chair that happens to be in the way. Its eyes were set deep under a heavy shelf of brow, dark and calm and absolutely fixed on the dogman, and whatever was happening behind those eyes, Doug was not part of it. And in the footage, the dogman howled. It was the first sound it had made, and it split the air like something breaking, a shriek with a growl underneath it, two frequencies layered in the same throat, building over 2 seconds to a pitch that made the air feel wrong and then cutting off like a switch had been thrown. It was a challenge. There was no other word for the sound, no other possible interpretation. The dogman was claiming the space, declaring itself, daring the thing at the tree line to take another step. If the dogman is challenging it instead of running, just how dangerous must the thing at the tree line actually be? Bigfoot's answer was to pick up a rock. The camera showed it moved to the edge of the clearing where a boulder had fractured and left a loose chunk of pale gray granite, grabbed the piece one-handed, 80 or 90 pounds of rock, one-handed, and threw it in a flat spinning arc like a discus. The rock crossed the clearing so fast that the camera barely tracked it. It caught the dogman across the ribs with a crack that echoed off every ridge wall in earshot and sent it skidding sideways across 6 feet of trail before it stopped against the base of a pine tree. Then the dogman got up. The way it got up was the first thing that told Doug tonight was not going to end cleanly. In the footage, you could see it rose with a controlled shake, favoring the right side where the rock had hit, and its ears were forward, and its eyes were bright, and the sound that came out of it now was lower and steadier. Not a challenge anymore, but something older and more patient. A deep, continuous growl that Doug felt in his back teeth. Bigfoot moved. The dogman launched itself straight at Sasquatch, ducked under the arm that swung for it, and opened Bigfoot's forearm with a full raking swipe on the way past. If something that fast can get inside the reach of arms that large, how long before one of those attacks lands somewhere fatal? Dark blood ran down the arm. Bigfoot looked at the wound. Not in pain. The expression, if it could be called that, was not pain. It was something closer to confirmation, like an answer to a question that had already been asked. The fight moved into the trees, and Doug followed. He knew how it looked. He knew the rational thing was to run in the other direction and not stop until he hit pavement. But he had a camera still rolling, and he had just watched things that no one in the history of documented human experience had ever filmed, and the part of him that was a ranger, or maybe just the part of him that was deeply, stubbornly human, could not let it go. He followed. He kept as much distance as the terrain allowed. The terrain did not allow much. How close can a human safely get to a fight between creatures that large before he becomes part of it? The forest on that stretch of ridge is old and dense and broken. Ravines cutting down toward the drainage, deadfall stacked in chest-high tangles, sight lines that open up for 20 feet and then close again. The dogman used all of it. It was never where Bigfoot expected it to be, circling through the shadows, feinting from one direction and coming from another, using its speed to stay just out of range of those enormous arms. It moved like it was made of decisions rather than muscle, every step a calculation, every retreat an invitation, drawing Bigfoot's weight and momentum in one direction, and then being somewhere else entirely by the time they arrived. Bigfoot's approach was different and brutal. It moved through the forest the way a flood moves through a canyon. It did not dodge the terrain, it removed it. Doug watched Bigfoot uproot a Douglas fir. How strong does something have to be to turn a living tree into a weapon? A mature tree 10 inches across at the base, standing 30 feet tall. Bigfoot took hold of the trunk about 4 feet up, dug its heels into the earth, and pulled in one single continuous motion. The root system tore free with a sound like the forest itself, tearing, a long, ripping groan of earth and rock and shredded root, and the whole tree came up, trailing clods of dark soil, and Bigfoot swung it. The root end was the heavy end. It connected with the dogman's flank and sent it cartwheeling into the far wall of a ravine with an impact that rattled Doug's camera from 40 feet away. Bark and rock and chunks of earth rained down for 3 full seconds afterward. Then the dogman climbed out of the ravine. How many times can something take punishment like that and still keep coming? It came up the wall fast and wrong, dropping to all fours for those few seconds in a way it hadn't moved before. And seeing it that way, lower, faster, more animal, was somehow worse than seeing it upright had been. It hit the rim and went straight over the top and onto Bigfoot's back in one unbroken motion, claws finding the fur and the flesh beneath, working toward the neck. The footage showed Bigfoot reaching back and couldn't get purchase. So it chose a different approach. It found the nearest large tree and walked backward into it at full speed. The impact was enormous. Birds left the canopy in every direction. Bark exploded off the trunk in chunks the size of dinner plates. Doug said he felt the concussion in his sternum from 40 feet back. The dogman dropped, hit the ground wrong, one leg folding under it, and still got up. The footage showed the terrain kept narrowing, the ridge on one side and the ravine on the other, and Doug was being pushed closer to both of them whether he wanted to be or not. At one point, he was 30 feet from Bigfoot. He could smell it, a deep animal musk, wet fur and exertion, and something older underneath, something that had no name in any category of experience he had. And it did not look at him once. He was no longer the target. He had never been more grateful for that in his life. The fight found its rhythm. The footage showed Bigfoot throwing rocks and trees, the dogman reading the windups and sliding around them, each exchange leaving damage on both sides. The dogman feinted and feinted until it found an opening, then came inside Bigfoot's reach and raked 4 claws across Sasquatch's face, forehead to chin, straight through, and the blood that followed was immediate and dark and ran into Bigfoot's eyes like paint. What happens when something that powerful is suddenly blinded by its own blood? In the audio of the footage, the sound that came out of Bigfoot then was not a roar. Or it was a roar, but calling it that the way you would call thunder a sound was technically accurate and completely insufficient. It was low and sustained, and it came from a chest cavity the size of a storage trunk, and it filled the forest the way a physical pressure fills a space, pressing outward against every surface, every tree, every stone, and for 3 full seconds after it ended, the forest was completely, absolutely silent. No wind, no birds, and no creek. Just that resonance fading through the trees and the blood on Bigfoot's face and the dogman still circling in the sudden absence of all other sound, and Doug standing 30 feet away, not breathing, not moving, feeling in some animal part of his brain that the sound he had just heard was a boundary marker, a declaration that this place, this moment, this outcome had already been decided, and everything still happening was just the world catching up. Both of them were damaged, but both of them were still moving. And somewhere above them, the sound of falling water kept growing louder as the ridge rose toward whatever was waiting at the top. The forest broke open without warning, and the sound hit him before the sight did. A deep, constant roar that rose up through the trees and swallowed everything else as the ridge crested. What happens when 2 monsters run out of forest and reach open ground? The footage showed that one step, Doug was in trees, and the next, he was standing on open rock, a wide stone shelf jutting out from the ridge into open air, 40 feet above a churning pool fed by a waterfall that came down hard through a notch in the rock above. The falls were loud enough that all other sound was simply gone, swallowed completely, replaced by that single, overwhelming roar. Mist hung over everything in a permanent white cloud. The rock underfoot was the dark red-brown of old iron and covered in a thin, treacherous skin of moisture that made every step feel like a negotiation with gravity. Doug moved carefully toward a boulder outcrop about 20 feet back from the edge and pressed himself against it. The stone was cold and slick against his back. Somewhere in the mist ahead of him, 2 things that should not exist were about to finish what they had started. The dogman was running out of body. If a predator built for speed is starting to fail physically, what kind of desperate decision comes next? It was obvious now. The way it held its right side, the shallow care in its breathing, the slight drag in the leg that had been crushed between Bigfoot's back and the tree. The speed was still there in bursts, but it cost something each time, and the intervals between those bursts were getting longer. It had backed itself toward the edge of the falls, putting 40 feet of empty air at its back, and it stood there in the spray and the gray light with its ears up and its eyes burning, and it looked not beaten. Something harder than beaten. Something that had made a choice and was done reconsidering it. Doug filmed it from behind the boulder and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like grief, that it was not going to stop. That there was no version of this where it stopped. Whatever the dogman was, it was not built for stopping, and it would go over that edge still fighting, still biting, still refusing, because that was the only mode it had. It charged. When a wounded predator makes one final charge, is it trying to win, or simply trying to take something with it? No wind-up and no hesitation. In the footage, you just see an explosion of movement off the whetstone. 3 strides, low and fast, and Bigfoot could only partly step aside. The dogman hit at shoulder height, and the impact twisted them both, a gash opening across Sasquatch's shoulder that ran deep, and for one awful moment, they were both moving toward the edge. Then Bigfoot's hand found the dogman's scruff, the dense fur at the back of the neck, and held. They grappled in the mist at the edge of the waterfall. The camera footage from those 30 seconds is mostly white, shapes moving through spray, the sound of impact and falls, and something that could be growling or could be the water, impossible to separate. Doug said that he was not breathing. He was braced against the boulder with the camera shaking in his grip, and he was watching 2 things, the size of small trucks, tear pieces out of each other at the edge of a 40-foot drop and his body had apparently decided that breathing was a lower priority than not making any sound or sudden movement that might remind either of them he existed. The dogman bit through 2 of Bigfoot's fingers. If a creature that strong can lose pieces of its own hand, how much worse can this fight still become? Doug saw it happen and recorded it, and still could not fully believe it. It got the ring and middle fingers of the left hand and twisted, and the last joint of each came away, and Bigfoot pulled back hard, but the damage was done. Blood running off the edge of the shelf in thin red lines, falling 40 feet through the mist and into the churning water below. The dogman scrambled backward on the wet granite, trying to reload for another charge, claws scratching uselessly at the slick surface. Nothing caught, nothing held. Bigfoot reached out with its right hand, the undamaged one. The fingers closed around the dogman's throat, and the sheer size of that hand, each finger longer than Doug's forearm, made the dogman look, for just that moment, almost small. Bigfoot drove straight down. The footage showed Dogman hit the rock shelf, and the impact traveled through the stone and into Doug's boots 20 feet away and up through his legs, and he felt it in his back teeth. The dogman clawed. It raked both hands down Bigfoot's arm, over and over, opening the skin in long parallel lines, blood pouring freely, running in bright threads toward the edge and over it, and none of it changed anything. The wet rock gave it nothing. No leverage, no purchase, and no way out. When the ground itself offers no escape, how long can even the most relentless predator keep fighting? One rear leg went over the edge, then the other, and Bigfoot walked it the rest of the way. A deliberate, unhurried march across the whetstone with the dogman dangling by its throat, claws still working, still fighting, still refusing, right up until the moment there was no more rock, and there was nothing under it but 40 feet of cold air. Then Bigfoot dropped the dogman. Doug recorded it fall in the waterfall, the whole 2 seconds of it. The sound it made hitting the water cut through the roar of the falls the way a gunshot cuts through a crowd, flat and final. And then the current had it. The white water took it northeast into the drainage, and in under 10 seconds, there was nothing. No body, no surfacing, and no disturbance on the water that indicated something that large had ever entered it. Just the falls, and the mist, and the creek bending away through the dark trees below. Doug pointed the camera at that water for a long time. He watched the surface and the foam and the place where the creek curved out of sight. Nothing came up, nothing came back. Bigfoot stood at the edge of the shelf for a moment, mist soaking its black fur, blood running from both arms and dripping off the ruined left hand into the spray. Standing above the water where the dogman had gone down, and then it turned and walked back into the forest. It did not look at the water. It did not look at the trees. It did not look at Doug. If something that powerful walks away without even acknowledging the human witness, what does that say about how little the human mattered in this encounter? It just walked, the same heavy, deliberate stride it had carried out of the tree line, and after 4 steps, the forest took it, and it was gone. The footage ends there. Whatever Doug Blanchett knows now that he did not know before he walked that trail, the camera at least confirms this much. It happened. The footage is real. The blood on the rock shelf was real. The shape of Bigfoot moving back into the dark between the trees was real. It was early September, a Tuesday morning, Mount Hood National Forest in Oregon. I knew the terrain of this trail well enough to run it without looking at my feet most of the time. I had the GoPro chest mounted because I was putting together footage for a video. Nothing dramatic, just a run edit. I parked at the trailhead a little after 6 in the morning, did a short warm-up, and headed out alone. 1 mile in, something crossed the trail ahead of me. It crossed at a full sprint, not bounding, not loping, but running with the kind of speed that takes up space in your field of vision and then is gone before you can form a complete thought about what you just saw. Upright, dark, enormous. It crossed maybe 30 yards ahead of me, from left to right, hit the tree line on the far side of the trail, and vanished into the undergrowth without slowing. The whole thing took less than 2 seconds. I stopped running. The forest went completely silent. What had just entered the woods that made everything else stop? Not gradually quiet the way a forest gets when something disturbs it and the birds settle down after a few minutes. immediately silent, the kind of silence that has a before and an after with nothing in between. No birds, no wind through the canopy, nothing moving in the brush on either side. I stood in that silence for what was probably 30 seconds and felt my heart rate drop from running pace down to something slower and more careful. Then I started running again. I had gone maybe 40 yards when I heard the first footfall behind me. It was bipedal. That was the first thing I registered. Not 4 impacts in sequence the way a bear or a deer moves, but 2, left, right, heavy and fast and spaced in a way that suggested a very long stride. The trail behind me had a slight uphill grade in that section, and I could hear the footfalls working against it without any apparent effort, each one hitting the packed dirt with a concussive weight that I could feel in my chest more than hear with my ears. I looked back. The GoPro caught it, a Bigfoot at full sprint, roughly 40 yards back, coming down the center of the trail. Dark brown fur, 9 feet tall at minimum, arms pumping in full running form the way a trained sprinter uses their arms, not swinging loosely the way you might expect. The stride was enormous. I tried to estimate it later using landmarks in the footage and came up with something close to 8 feet per step. Each footfall hit the trail hard enough that the audio track on the GoPro has a rhythmic thumping underneath everything else in that section of the recording. If something that big could move that fast, what chance did a trail runner actually have? I stopped looking back and ran as hard as I could. Trail running and survival running are not the same thing. Trail running involves pacing, reading terrain, conserving energy for climbs, managing your breathing around effort. It is a controlled thing. You are always making small decisions. When to push, when to ease off, where to put your foot on a technical section. Survival running is none of that. It is just output. Every system maxed out immediately, form degrading in the first 30 seconds. Nothing held in reserve. No ceiling on what you are willing to spend. I went to full output in about 4 strides and held it. My breathing went ragged fast and stayed that way. The trail ahead was slightly downhill for the next 200 yards, and I let gravity contribute to whatever my legs were doing and kept my eyes forward. The gap closed anyway. I could hear it without looking, the footfalls getting louder, the spacing between them making it clear that whatever pace I had found, the Bigfoot was running faster. I looked back again at what felt like 30 yards, but was probably less, and saw it still in full stride, not appearing to breathe hard, not appearing to have any particular urgency about it, just running with a kind of mechanical efficiency that had no ceiling I could identify. Long arms, wide shoulders, head held forward, eyes straight ahead on the trail. Eyes on me. Was I watching something that already knew how this chase was going to end? The downhill section came and I opened a small gap, maybe 5 yards, and held it for roughly 20 seconds. Then the terrain flattened and the gap disappeared in a matter of strides. The Bigfoot ran the downhill like it was flat ground. No adjustment in its body, no shift in its form, just the same efficient stride eating up the same amount of trail per second, regardless of the angle. I was screaming, I found out later when I reviewed the audio. Not words, just sound, the involuntary noise that comes out of a person when their body has understood something that their brain is still catching up to. I did not know I was doing it at the time. The gap was down to 25 yards and still closing when the trail narrowed. The single track through that section of Mount Hood runs tight, maybe 3 feet wide, with the tree canopy dropping low on both sides where the younger growth crowds in against the established trail corridor. The light went from gray and open to darker and more compressed, and the change in the sound was immediate. The Bigfoot's footfalls got louder in the enclosed space, more directional, easier to track. 20 yards back, still closing. I hit a hard switchback, a sharp left-hand turn that dropped me briefly out of the direct line, and gained maybe 3 seconds. I heard the Bigfoot hit the turn behind me, and I looked back expecting it to slow, expecting the angle to cost it something. Was this the first mistake it would make in the chase? It left the trail entirely. It went straight through the brush on the inside of the turn, crashed through the undergrowth, and came out on the far side of the switchback, already realigned with the trail. It lost almost nothing. The 3 seconds became 1 second, maybe less. I watched it happen over my shoulder with the GoPro capturing the whole thing, and what hit me was not just the speed but the decision-making. It had looked at the switchback, done the geometry of it, and chosen the shorter path. That is not an animal reacting. That is a calculation. Mid-turn, I got its face on camera for the first time, not from 40 yards, but from close enough that the GoPro resolved the details clearly. Wide face, flat across the features, with a heavy jaw and a prominent brow ridge. The eyes were forward-facing and dark and locked straight ahead. Not on the trail, on me. The expression, if I had to describe it, was not rage and not excitement. It was focus. The expression of something that was very good at this particular thing and was fully engaged in doing it. If that focus never broke, how long before it finally caught me? Then it vocalized. A sharp, explosive bark, not the drawn-out howl that people describe in most Sasquatch accounts, but a single, percussive sound, short and directional, the kind of sound that you feel in your sternum before your ears fully register it. Not a warning, not a territorial display. Something purposeful. I flinched physically when it happened and nearly lost my footing on the turn, my stride breaking apart for a half-second, before I found it again and kept moving. Then something answered it from the left flank. A different call, slightly lower in pitch, from a position maybe 50 yards into the trees to my left and ahead of my current position. Not behind me. Ahead and to the left. Already repositioned, already waiting. I hadn't heard it move. I hadn't heard anything move. Whatever was on my left flank had gotten there without making a sound, which meant it had been moving while the one behind me had been making noise, while I had been focused on the one behind me. The two calls overlapped for a moment, the one behind me and the one to my left, and the pattern of them, the back and forth of it, was not random noise. It was not the ambient sound of a forest reacting to a disturbance. It was the same structured exchange as any two people calling to each other across a distance to establish position, to confirm that the other was in place, to signal that the setup was ready. Had I already been running into an ambush without realizing it? Had every step I'd taken since this started been a step they had already planned for me? The Bigfoot behind me was not just chasing me, it was driving me. There is a difference between those two things. A chase is reactive, it follows you wherever you go. What was happening here was directional. The one behind me had been pushing me left from the moment it stepped onto the trail, and the one on the left flank had been positioned ahead of me to the left to receive whatever the one behind me delivered. I had been running a line someone else had drawn. I understood it in the same instant that I understood I had been going left, following the trail left around the switchback, away from the call on the left flank, which meant I had been going exactly where the one behind me was pushing me to go. I cut hard right off the trail and into the open forest on the right side, angling away from both vocalizations, trying to break the geometry of whatever was being set up around me. The Sasquatch behind me adjusted without missing a beat. Had it expected that move all along? I heard it leave the trail and come into the open forest after me, crashing through the undergrowth with no apparent concern about the noise it was making. The one on the left flank went quiet. I could not hear it anymore, which was not reassuring. It did not mean it had stopped. It meant it had stopped making sound. The rocky section comes about 1.5 miles into that trail system, a stretch where the path crosses a ridge of exposed basalt and the footing gets technical. Irregular surfaces, loose stones at the edges, roots breaking through between the rock faces. Under normal conditions, I slowed down through that section and picked my steps. Under these conditions, I did not slow down and I did not pick my steps. And about 30 yards into the rock section, a root caught my lead foot and I went down hard. I slid on the basalt for several feet, tore the knee of my running tights, felt the skin go on my right palm, and came to a stop against a larger rock at the trail's edge. The GoPro stayed mounted, the chest harness held, and the footage from those seconds is some of the clearest in the entire recording because the camera was briefly stationary, pointing back up the trail. The Bigfoot was 15 yards away. How much distance is 15 yards when something that large is already moving at full speed? It had closed from 25 yards to 15 in the 3 seconds it took me to fall and stop. 15 yards is 45 feet. I know what 45 feet looks like on a trail, and I know what it looks like on that specific piece of footage, and it is close enough that the GoPro resolved the fur texture on its chest and shoulders, the individual fingers of its right hand as the arms swung in its stride, and the visible cloud of breath in the cold morning air coming from its nose and mouth as it ran. It stopped when I stopped. Not immediately, it took a step or two to decelerate, but it stopped and stood there at 15 yards while I scrambled back to my feet and got my legs under me. My right knee had taken the impact and was sending a hot, sharp signal up my leg with every movement, not a signal I could ignore. The kind of signal that tells you something structural has been compromised, and the next 40 minutes are going to be a different experience than the previous 40. If it could see that I was injured, what did that change about the way this was going to end? I started running again on the damaged knee, and the Bigfoot started running again behind me. And then it slowed down, not to a stop, not to a walk. It slowed to exactly the pace I was now capable of running, and it held that pace, and it maintained the same gap, 15 yards, not closing, not falling back, matching me. I looked back twice in the next 30 seconds, and both times it was there. Same distance, same steady stride, watching me move with the same forward-locked focus it had shown since the beginning. This was worse than the sprint. The sprint had been terrifying, but it had been simple. Something fast coming at you requires a simple response, which is to run. This was not simple. This was the Bigfoot demonstrating that it knew I was hurt, that it understood what hurt meant in terms of what I could do next, and that it had made a decision to wait rather than close. It was patient in a way that felt deliberate and measured. It was waiting me out. If it was waiting instead of attacking, what exactly was it waiting for? The trail opened up about a quarter mile past the rock section, a stretch of maybe 50 yards where the trees pulled back on both sides and the sightline extended. The morning light was fuller in the open section, and after the compressed darkness of the narrow trail, the brightness registered as a physical relief, the way light always does when you have been in the dark long enough. The second Bigfoot was standing in the trail ahead of me. It had stepped out of the tree line on the left side of the trail and stopped, facing me, arms at its sides, completely still, not approaching, just there, in the center of the trail, blocking the forward line. I skidded to a stop on the open trail, and the one behind me stopped simultaneously, still at 15 yards, as if we had all agreed to pause. Was this the moment the chase officially turned into something else? I was standing between two Bigfoot on an open trail with a damaged knee and no cover within reach. The open section of trail that had looked like relief 30 seconds ago, the brightness of it, the space, had turned into a problem. There was nowhere on that 50-yard stretch where I could not be clearly seen from both directions, and both directions currently had a Bigfoot in them. The second one was slightly shorter than the first, maybe 8.5 feet, but broader across the chest and shoulders, with fur that ran more auburn than dark brown, a reddish-brown tone that caught the open light differently than the first one had in the shadows of the tree canopy. It stood with the same quality of stillness the first one had shown when it stopped, not frozen, not tense, just still in the way that something is still when it has no reason to move yet. Its eyes were forward-facing and dark, the same as the first. It was looking at me the same way the first one had looked at me. Neither of them moved. Neither of them made a sound. The only audio on the GoPro in that section is my breathing. Fast, shallow. The breathing of someone whose body is trying to process more than it has the capacity to process at one time. I went right. There was no calculation in it. The trail was blocked ahead, and there was a Bigfoot behind me, and the only open direction was right, where the ground dropped away from the trail edge into a shallow creek drainage, a rocky channel with maybe 6 inches of water running through it, the kind of seasonal drainage that floods in winter and runs low in September. I went over the trail edge and down the bank and hit the creek at a run, and my trail shoes went onto wet rock immediately, and I nearly went down again before I found the footing. Would the water and rock slow them down the way it slowed me? The creek bed was rough going, uneven basalt covered in a thin layer of algae, the water cold enough that I could feel it through my shoes on contact, the banks on both sides dropping away steeply enough that climbing out would cost time, and the knee did not want to do the lateral movement required. I stayed in the water and ran. The Bigfoot behind me followed into the creek. I heard it hit the bank and come down, and then I heard each footfall in the water behind me. A deep concussive splash every time one of those feet came down in the drainage, the sound of it reverberating off the rock walls of the channel. I looked back, and the GoPro got a full rear shot of it, mid-stride in the water, both arms out slightly for balance, the creek exploding off each footfall in a white spray that caught the early light. It moved across the wet rock with total ease. Where my trail shoes were slipping and forcing me to shorten my stride and drop my pace, it moved as if the surface were no different from the packed dirt of the trail. No adjustment, no slipping, no reduction in pace. If the terrain slowed me, but not it, how long before the distance disappeared again? My knee was getting worse with every stride on the uneven rock. The altitude was working against me. That section of trail sits above 3,000 feet, and the thinner air at elevation is something you adapt to over time, but never fully account for when your body is already under maximum stress. I was deteriorating faster than my fear could compensate for. I checked the GoPro battery out loud. I heard myself do it on the audio later, 34%, and kept moving. The drainage curved left after about 100 yards and then opened onto a wider section where the banks dropped to almost nothing, just a low step up onto flat ground covered in fern and moss. I pulled myself up out of the creek and looked back. The Bigfoot had stopped at the bank. Why would something that had followed me this far suddenly refuse to climb out after me? It was standing at the edge of the drainage, in the water, watching me climb out onto the flat ground. It did not follow me up the bank. It stood there and watched me go. And I stood there for a moment, watching it watch me, both of us breathing hard. Me audibly, it in those visible cold air clouds from its nose and mouth. And then I turned and ran into the open forest. The second Bigfoot was gone. No sound from the left flank, no movement in the trees ahead. I ran through the open forest section without a trail to follow, picking the line through the trees that looked most open, angling in the direction I knew the fire road to be from memory of the trail map. The knee was talking to me on every stride. My water bottle was mostly empty. The GoPro battery was at 34%. Could I reach the fire road before either of them cut me off again? No sound from the left flank the whole way. The second Bigfoot had gone quiet after I came up out of the creek and stayed quiet. The original one, the dark brown one, the first, I could no longer hear behind me either. No footfalls on the forest floor, no breathing, no movement in the undergrowth. Either they had stopped following me or they had gotten better at doing it quietly, and I had no way to know which. The forest was silent all the way to the convergence. I came back onto the trail proper through a gap in the undergrowth about 200 yards from where I had gone off it. The fire road was visible through the trees ahead. The line of it, the different quality of light that open ground has compared to closed canopy, maybe 200 yards away, possibly a little less. Close enough that I could see it clearly and hold that image in my head as something concrete. Out of nowhere, both Bigfoot emerged from the trees behind me at the same time. Had they been shadowing me the entire time without making a sound? They came out onto the trail simultaneously from opposite sides, the first one from the right, the second from the left. And they were 50 yards back when they appeared. They were not running. They were walking side by side on the trail at a steady, unhurried pace, and the shift from what the chase had been to what this was hit me harder than most of what had come before it. A chase is comprehensible. Something chasing you is operating on a logic you can understand, even if you cannot outrun it. This was different. They were not chasing anymore. They were behind me, and they were walking, and the word that kept coming back to me as I watched them over my shoulder was escort. They were walking me out, 100 yards to the fire road. I did not slow down. The knee was screaming, and my lungs were at their limit, but I did not slow down. And the two Bigfoot behind me kept the same 50-yard distance without any apparent effort, walking at a pace that covered ground faster than their relaxed gait suggested. I filmed them over my shoulder for most of that final 100 yards. The footage is steady enough to see both of them clearly, side by side, the difference in their coloring visible in the open light, moving together with the same forward stillness they had shown every time they stopped. If they could close the gap whenever they wanted, Why were they making sure it stayed exactly 50 yards? I hit the fire road at a dead run and crossed it. On the far side, the trail continued down toward the parking lot, and I went down it another 40 or 50 yards before I finally slowed and stopped and turned around. My legs had made the decision before my brain did. They simply stopped taking strides. The Bigfoot had stopped at the fire road. Was the road the boundary they had been pushing me toward the entire time? Both of them were standing at the tree line on the far side of the road, in the shadow where the trail met the forest edge. Still, silent, watching me across the open width of the fire road, the way they had been watching me for the past mile and a half, with that same forward, locked attention that I had not been able to read as anger or excitement or anything else I had a name for. I raised the GoPro and pointed it at them and held it there and filmed them standing at the tree line. Then the first Bigfoot, the original one, the dark brown one, the one that had crossed the trail in front of me a mile in and started all of this, turned away from me and walked to the largest tree on the road's edge. A Douglas fir, 4 feet across at the base, maybe more. An old tree, the kind of tree that has been there long enough to anchor itself deep into the basalt and hardpan below the soil. The kind of tree that does not move when the wind comes through hard in November because its root system has 30 or 40 years of grip on the ground around it. What could it possibly intend to do with a tree that size? The Bigfoot gripped the trunk with both hands. The fingers wrapped around the near side of the bark and the arms pulled, and for 1 second, nothing happened. 1 second of what looked like resistance, the tree holding, and then the sound started. A deep crack from somewhere below the ground, then a groan that ran up through the trunk and out through the canopy, and then a tearing sound that was enormous and low and continuous as the root system came up out of the earth on the far side of the trunk, the soil breaking open around the base of the tree in a rough circle, the root ball lifting like the edge of a lid being pried off. The GoPro audio clipped on the loudest part of it. The recording distorts and comes back. And then the tree was tilting, slowly at first, and then not slowly at all, the full height of it swinging in a long arc across the fire road and hitting the ground on the far side with an impact that came up through my feet. If it could uproot something that massive without hesitation, what exactly was it trying to communicate to me? The dust settled. The echo of it moved through the trees in both directions. The Bigfoot stood over the fallen trunk with both hands still resting on the bark. A Douglas fir of that size, 4 feet at the base, carries somewhere between 40 and 60,000 pounds of weight. I looked that up later. I spent some time with that number. It turned its head and looked directly at me. Not at the tree, not at the road, not at the second Bigfoot standing 10 feet away, at me. Across the width of the fire road, over the trunk of the tree now lying across it, through the dust still settling in the morning air. It held that for 5 full seconds. I counted them because the GoPro was recording, and I wanted the footage to have a number attached to it. Was it making sure I understood that the display had been meant specifically for me? Then both Bigfoot turned and walked into the forest, and were gone. The trees closed behind them. No sound, no vocalization, no crashing through undergrowth. Just gone, the way the first one had been when it crossed the trail in front of me at the start of this, before I understood what kind of morning it was going to be. If they could disappear that easily, how often had they been watching runners on that trail without anyone realizing it? The tree was still across the fire road when I drove past it on the way out. I did not stop. I did not get out of the car and stand next to it and take a picture. I drove past it and kept driving and did not stop until I was back on the highway.